Okay, today we're going to be looking at what happened in language teaching from about the 1970s onwards, when it started to change radically. Britain and the States went off in two slightly different directions, although they've now, I think, come back together again. But today we're going to be looking at what happened in Britain, and when we get to Unit 3, we'll be considering what was happening in the States as well. We finished last time by suggesting that the death knell of audiolingualism was sounded by Chomsky in 1959 with his attack on the behaviourist theory of learning. This, together with his own work in linguistics, which attacked the structuralist view of language, really meant that the method started to be very severely questioned. In his review of Skinner's verbal behaviour, the first point that Chomsky made was that as humans learn language and animals don't, there must be something different in a human brain that makes this possible, and therefore behaviourism, which had studied animal behaviour, was irrelevant to the study of language acquisition. He posited the existence of an innate neurological mechanism which he at first called the language acquisition device, but later expanded into the idea of a universal grammar. Chomsky suggested that the human brain is already hardwired to recognize the existence of certain grammatical categories that will be the same in all languages. All languages, for instance, will possess verbs, and those verbs will have subjects and objects. The languages may seem different superficially. For example, they won't all have the subject, verb, object order of English, but they can only differ within the bounds of the universal grammar. The other point he made was that language acquisition can't just be explained through learning by repetition. He pointed to the type of errors which children acquiring their first language will make, like saying I goed or I seed instead of the irregular forms. Chomsky argued that this is evidence that the child has learned a rule and is applying it. For the child, the past form is ed. Similarly, the ability to invent a sentence which is completely grammatical, like colourless green ideas sleep furiously, shows that we are applying rules. We've never heard it before. We can't possibly be imitating and repeating that sentence. It's completely new. Well, it isn't now, but it was when, because everybody quotes it, but it was when Chomsky invented it. But it shows that we recognize it to be grammatical, even though it's completely meaningless. We're applying a rule. Chomsky also showed that structural linguistics, which is the view that language consists of building blocks combined in specific orders to make meanings, was completely unable to explain a number of things. For instance, sentences like John is eager to please and John is easy to please, which have exactly the same structure, or what Chomsky called the same surface structure. The meaning, however, is quite different. Just ask yourself in each case who's pleased and who does the pleasing. It's quite different. Similarly, we can recognize two completely different meanings for an ambiguous sentence like the shooting of the hunters was terrible, or we might realize that an active sentence and a passive sentence, which have different structures, are related, have the same meaning. Chomsky therefore posited the existence of an abstract mental construct, something that he called deep structure, and later on just D structure, in which the surface structure is disambiguated by assigning roles to different parts of the sentence, like agent, the thing that does the action, or patient, the thing that receives the action. If deep structure is able to identify what's the agent, what's the patient, it explains why we can understand the difference in meaning between two structures like John is easy or John is eager to please, even though the surface structure is identical. Chomsky also introduced the difference between competence, what the speaker or the speaker's brain actually knows about the language, and performance, what the speaker will produce under real conditions like the ones I'm talking under now, which will contain slips of grammar, pronunciation, repetition of words and hesitations, that sort of thing. Chomsky was actually only interested in competence, not in performance at all, and only then on grammatical competence. What he wasn't interested in is how people actually use the language. However, at about this time, a lot of other linguists were starting to investigate language use. Um, Austin and Searle came up with what they called speech act theory. They pointed out that in a sentence like, I name this ship the Queen Elizabeth, or whatever, by saying I name this ship, you actually do it. You perform the action that the verb actually describes. And they called these performative verbs. So for example, I suggest is a performative verb. If I say I suggest that we stop now, by saying I suggest, I'm actually suggesting. However, they pointed out that there are many other ways of suggesting than using the verb I suggest. If I say, what should we buy her for Christmas? And somebody says, she likes plants, that's just as good a suggestion as I suggest we buy her a plant. They called these speech acts or illocutionary acts, but they're what we've come to know in language teaching as function. Be careful about the word function if you come across it in your reading, because linguistics uses it in a completely different way, which we'll see sooner or later on the course. Another linguist who was important at this time was Hymes, who introduced the idea of communicative competence. The idea that you don't just need grammatical competence, knowing the rules of grammar, but you actually know how to use the language. There are rules of use without which the rules of grammar are useless, was the famous quote. What did he mean by that? First of all, he pointed out that language needed to be formally possible, in other words, grammatically correct. He's not throwing grammatical competence out. So, give David those books is okay, but give those books David is not. The asterisk, by the way, is the way that linguistics indicates that a sentence is not possible, is incorrect in some way. He also said that sentences needed to be feasible, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. The third category, which is obviously has been taken up by language teaching, is the idea of appropriacy. The sentence, could I make so bold as to bother you to give David those books, is perfectly grammatical, but it's formally possible, as Hymes would say. It's also feasible, as we'll see in a minute, but it's not appropriate, or it would be very unlikely to be appropriate in most situations. And finally, is something actually done? For example, we can talk about the mother tongue or native language or first language, but we don't talk about a mother language or a native tongue or a first tongue or whatever. Okay, let's go back to whether the language is actually feasible. In a sense, we can forget about this, because if something is not feasible to say, then nobody, whether us or our students, are going to try anyway. But it's fun, so we'll look at it. Okay, I'm going to say a sentence, and to make it easier for you to understand it, I've given you some pictures, but I have to warn you that I'm starting from the last picture and working back. Here goes. This is the town, the river, the house, the barn, the corn, the rat, the cat chased, ate, was stored in, was next to, was on the other side of, flowed through. Now I'd be very, very surprised if you managed to take that in. That's what's called a left branching sentence. It's perfectly grammatical, and I'm going to show you why in a minute, but it's said in a form that our brains just can't take in. Okay, I would be very surprised if you could even understand that sentence, let alone reproduce it. I could only do it because I worked it out for about 20 minutes and wrote it down. If, on the other hand, I start from the other end and right branch, I think you'll find it's much easier. This is the cat that chased the rat, that ate the corn that was stored in the barn, that was next to the house, that was across the river, that flowed from the town. Okay, I managed to do that without even looking at what I'd written down. I hesitated at the end. It should have been that flowed through the town, but you get the idea. I'm sure you could now repeat that sentence by looking at the pictures. Okay, so there's the sentence. Let's look at why that is actually a grammatical sentence, I mean the first version. If we take just, this is the rat the cat chased, okay, you can see it's perfectly grammatical. And if I add another one, this is the corn the rat the cat chased ate, I'm just applying the same rule that I applied in the first sentence again. So again, it's perfectly grammatical. But it is starting to get difficult. It's not quite so feasible for our brain to take it in. As I go on adding more, this is the barn, the corn, the rat, the cat chased ate was stored in, it gets more and more difficult or less feasible for our brain to actually cope with. And as I go on, as you can see, it gets totally unmanageable. So this is what Hymes meant by the concept of feasibility, things like left branching structures, which the brain would never actually try and do. So just before the development of the communicative approach, we had a situation where in psychology, behaviorism had been replaced by cognitive code theory, the idea that learning, yes, there was some aspect of mental behavior, abstract mental processes going on, particularly in language acquisition. That in linguistics there'd been a change of focus from form to use. And apart from that, also in the socio-economic situation, the increasing importance of the European Common Market meant that there was much more interest in language learning and a need for effective language learning, particularly in Europe. The communicative approach is always thought of as being started off by some work of the Council of Europe, which we'll see later. But I'd like to suggest that the time anyway was ripe and things were changing, and that the change was being led by International House in London, and particularly by John and Brita Haycraft, who were the founders of International House. They'd started teaching, or started their first school back in 1953, and were thoroughly fed up with what they saw as the boring, static type of lessons that were normally advocated. And they introduced a completely new approach, which was dynamic, based around drama, role play, where students were asked to actually use the language. They had lessons with a PPP structure, presentation, practice, and then production, where the language was actually put into use. They set up an English teaching theatre, and above all, they started the first EFL training courses. Were it not for John Haycraft in particular, we probably wouldn't have been here, because it was John Haycraft who started off the idea of the what was then called the RSA certificate, which later split into CELTA and Delta, or other things before, but ended up as CELTA and Delta. So I think the climate was right. The stage was set for some sort of change towards language use. And this culminated in the work of the Council of Europe and their attempt to define a standard syllabus which was going to be used throughout Europe, what we now know as the Common European Framework, though at the beginning it was much less ambitious than that. They started off with what was called the threshold level, which was a syllabus to be used at roundabout lower intermediate level. Based on the work of David Wilkins at the University of Reading, the Council of Europe syllabus, the threshold level, described language as made up of notional and functional categories. And people often get confused about what's the difference between a notion and a function. So I want to look at that for a moment now. Okay, first of all, notion. Notion is the basic conceptual meaning, often seen as categories like time, duration, and so on. But let's make it simpler. Let's take the notion of a cat. The notion of a cat is a small domestic feline with a tendency to stick its claws into you, purr like mad if you stroke it, and ask for its dinner very frequently. That's its basic semantic meaning, and that never changes. However I use the word cat, always underlying that word is that particular meaning. What, however, if I walk into a room with someone who's allergic to cats and see one sitting on the armchair and say, "Cat"? I'm giving a warning. I'm warning the person to get out quick. So function is how the word or the phrase is actually used in context. Nobody would want to say that the word cat means a warning. It doesn't, but it can be used in that way. Okay, let's take the example of "do you mind?" Now, the notion of mind is one of displeasure. Okay, whereas we've also got the interrogative form, so the notion of that particular form is an inquiry, okay, asking about something, which means that put them together and "do you mind" is an inquiry about displeasure. That was the notion. What about the function? Have a look at this dialogue, okay, which finishes, "Do you mind staying late?" Quite clearly there, the function of "do you mind" is to make a request. On the other hand, in this dialogue, where we've still got "do you mind staying late" exactly the same, I'm actually asking for information. So although the structure is exactly the same, the words are exactly the same, and the notion is exactly the same, in both cases I'm inquiring about displeasure. The function changes depending on the context. So this is something to remember, that function is always a matter of the context of the sentence. It's dependent on the context. Whereas the notion, inquiring about displeasure, is always there. It's the basic meaning of the phrase. Obviously, when we're teaching, we're quite used to having objectives which combine structural, functional and notional categories. For example, students will be able to talk about past events with a present result. There you've got your notional category, past events, present results, those are notions, using the present perfect simple, and there we've got our structural objective. Whereas here, students will be able to make polite requests for action. A polite request is a function, and then we specify again the structure using "would you mind" plus the verb plus ing. So when we're teaching, sometimes it's easier to focus on the notions, the general, the basic meaning of what we're actually, the structure we're focusing on. Other times we want to look at it as how it's actually used in a context, and we focus on the function. As the communicative approach developed, there was a complete change in what actually happened in the classroom, and in the next video we'll be looking at some materials and just seeing. One of the most radical changes was the difference in attitude to skills teaching. Teaching reading, speaking, listening, writing was no longer seen just as an automatic consequence of learning the grammar and the vocabulary of the language. It was seen that you actually had to teach students to do these things, to listen, to write, and so on. Alongside this came the idea that authentic materials could be used. In the audiolingual period, this would have been impossible because of the idea that language should be so strictly controlled, and that students should only be exposed to language that they were able to understand and use. Now there was the idea that receptive competence, the ability to understand, could in fact be developed far more quickly than productive competence, the ability to use the language, and that many students actually needed a higher receptive competence than they did a productive competence. In terms of teaching speaking, there was a change in emphasis on accuracy, that everything had to be exactly correct, no error whatsoever, to an emphasis on fluency, and the use of free practice activities or production activities to allow students to use the language freely. These were very often based on an information gap activity, an activity where students had different information and had to talk about it, pooling their information in order to complete a task. Alongside this came the idea that error is not something to be avoided at all costs, but in a certain sense to be encouraged because it's a natural part of language learning. It shows that students are actually trying the language out, very much like the child who says, I seed, rather than I saw. It's showing that they have learnt something and are trying to put it into practice. There was also the idea of needs analysis and gearing the syllabus, gearing the course to the learner's needs. Now, these could be general purpose courses, which would now be centered around everyday topics like free time, house and home, the sort of thing that everybody needs to talk about all the time. But also there was the development of ESP courses, English for business, English for nurses, English for doctors and so on, where the syllabus could be entirely based on defined needs, and the idea that it wasn't necessary to start right at the beginning and teach the whole language necessarily, that for some people it was possible just to teach certain aspects of the language, certain structures and so on, and skip over completely other things that they didn't need. And finally, there was quite a difference in the role of the teacher. The teacher was no longer the authority, the person who decided exactly what was going to be taught, when, for how long, and whether the student had got it right or not. The teacher was now a needs analysis and a planner of the course, but planning based on the definition of the student's needs, which were decided in consultation with the student. Similarly, the materials for the course were no longer set. The teacher would be the person who organised the materials, who chose the materials based on the definition of the student's needs. The teacher was seen as the student's guide to the language, helping the student communicate the meanings which he or she wanted to or needed to communicate, and also helping the student to learn in the most effective way possible. So at this time there were very decided differences from what had gone before, but on the other hand there were other things which weren't quite so radical, which we'll see in the next video.